We begin our deep dive tonight, high above the tree line on a frozen, hostile slope in the northern Ural Mountains. So if you can, just try to picture this. It's the deep Soviet winter of 1959. And imagine the silence, just this vast, endless snow, and it's only broken by the brutal whipping of the wind, the air temperatures plunging, way below zero, scouring this remote peak known to the local Mansi people as Koletschok, or Dead Mountain.
It's a scene of just absolute life-extinguishing isolation. And the story we're tracking, it involves a group of 9 highly experienced trekkers. These were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were led by a 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, and they were on what's called a Grade 3 expedition.
Which is the most difficult classification, right?
Most difficult. It requires tremendous skill and resilience. Their goal was a multi-day trek to the peak of Gora Otorten.
But their journey didn't end in triumph. It ended in this mystery that is so contradictory, so chilling in its specifics, that it's just resisted decades of investigation. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack the source material. We have diaries, photographs they took, the forensic evidence, which is deeply unsettling.
And the official reports, which conflict with each other. And of course, the enduring theories that swirl around their deaths.
We really have to ask what force, and it could be natural, it could be military, something else entirely, what terrified these trained professionals so completely that they chose to flee their only shelter into certain death.
And to really understand the gravity of that, you first have to recognize the caliber of these people. These were not novices. They were, masters of their environment. The group, it actually started with 10 people.
Right.
But on January 28th, something critical happened. One member, Yuri Yudin, he was forced to turn back. He had severe joint and knee pain from some pre-existing conditions, radiculitis and a congenital heart defect.
And that single decision, which was just born of physical necessity, it tragically saved his life. And that fact, it just shadowed his entire existence. He carried this burden of that choice and later just intense guilt for the rest of his days.
There's such a poignant detail there. As he was saying goodbye to his friend, Ludmila Dubinina, she gave him this small, fluffy toy, a teddy bear. And he kept it, as a personal talisman right up until his death in 2013.
That memory, a small, soft toy exchanged in this brutal Arctic landscape, it's just such a stark reminder of the youth and the intense personal connection of this group we lost.
Let's track their final documented movements. Up until that last night, the group started their transit after arriving by train in Ivdel. That was January 25th. That was basically the northernmost outpost of this Sverdlovsk region. From there, they took a trek to Vizhai, which was the last inhabited settlement.
Last stop before the wilderness?
Exactly. And then they began skiing toward their objective, Gora Otorten, on January 27th.
And their progress, you can see in the diaries, it just confirms their professionalism. On January 31st, they reached a really critical staging point. They got to the edge of the highland area, and they spent time setting up a necessary supply cache in a wooded valley.
And this takes real effort. You have to dig out a protected spot, secure all your surplus food, spare warm equipment, fuel. All of it was intended for their return trip.
This wasn't an oversight. This was, standard, highly disciplined procedure for a multi-week expedition. It just confirms they were prepared for contingencies.
So the fatal sequence really begins on February 1st. Their initial plan, it was likely to just traverse the pass and make camp on the opposite side. But the weather, it just rapidly deteriorated.
The diaries mention it right. Increasing snowfall, intense snowstorms, and the visibility just dropping to almost nothing. A whiteout.
And in those conditions, they deviated. They went west, moving toward the top of Koletschok instead of, traversing the pass cleanly.
And this brings us to the core mystery of their survival strategy. When they realized they were on this exposed slope at over 1,000 meters, they could have descended. It was a manageable distance, about 1.5 kilometers down to the forested area.
Which would have provided natural life-saving shelter.
Exactly. But instead, they made this inexplicable decision. They chose to set up camp directly on that exposed mountain slope.
The sheer irrationality of that choice is really the first piece of evidence that tells you something unusual was happening before the disaster even struck.
Yeah.
Yuri Yudin, the survivor, he struggled with this later. He speculated that maybe Dyatlov wanted to practice camping on a difficult slope, or maybe he just didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained.
But even he found those rationalizations kind of hollow.
They felt hollow. Why would you risk the entire expedition and, the lives of your team for a simple training exercise in a life-threatening storm? It just doesn't track.
And you have to remember the experience level in that group. Dyatlov was a skilled leader, sure, but you also have people like Semyon Zolotaryov. He was a World War II veteran, significantly older, and an expert survivalist.
A total expert. The idea that Zolotaryov or any of the others would agree to put themselves in such a vulnerable position just to save altitude, it feels highly suspicious.
It suggests something else was at play, a compulsion, a state of confusion. Or maybe they were looking for a specific vantage point for reasons we just can't understand.
And the conditions that night were just lethal. We know the temperature dipped below -25°C, probably got down to -30, and that's before you add the constant, relentless katabatic winds, which create a wind chill far, far below the actual air temperature. Survival in those conditions demands immediate shelter.
And to even establish their camp, they didn't just pitch the tent. They had to take a specialized shovel and make a deep horizontal cut directly into the snow and the slope itself to create a flat, rigid surface for the tent floor.
And this is a crucial detail that was, initially overlooked. They spent valuable time and energy anchoring themselves into this dangerous position. They were essentially reinforcing their presence under what we now know is an impending unseen threat. And as we'll get into, the very act of cutting into that slope, well, it may have been the most fatal decision of the entire trip.
So when the group didn't return to Visay, and they didn't send that expected telegram saying they'd made it, a search began. But it was slow to get going.
Very slow. It wasn't until February 20th that the official search teams, including military and volunteers, really started looking in earnest. The tent itself was finally discovered 6 days after that, on February 26th. So that's 26 days after the incident.
And the scene they found at the tent, it remains one of the most chilling images in modern mystery. The tent was still partially standing, anchored by their ski poles, and crucially, it wasn't collapsed or buried under a huge amount of snow.
Right. Instead, it had been deliberately sliced open, not torn by an animal, not ripped by a storm. It was cut very clearly from the inside, which confirms this frantic internal necessity to get out.
And here's the paradox that just confounded investigators right from the start. All of their vital, life-saving equipment and supplies were still inside. The tent was a repository of survival.
Everything. 9 storm jackets, 5 pairs of felt boots, Zolotaryov's quilted sleeping boots, axes, fuel, food, their cameras. Nothing essential had been taken.
Which suggests they fled a sudden, overwhelming threat that gave them no time for rational thought.
The core enigma is precisely that. The fact that 9 trained professional people fled into a sub-zero night without their proper clothing. Some were found in just thin clothes, some in socks, some completely barefoot.
What terrifying immediate threat could possibly be worse than the certain, agonizing death of freezing at -30°C? They chose the certainty of freezing over whatever horror was outside that tent.
And yet, the paradox just deepens when you analyze the evidence of their flight path. If they were fleeing an immediate physical threat, like an animal or a person, you'd expect them to be running frantically, stumbling over each other in pure panic.
A chaotic scene.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the investigators noted the footprints. They led away from the tent, down toward the woods, over a kilometer downhill, and they suggested the group was walking at a steady, calm pace, maybe even single file.
Which implies a strange kind of psychological disorientation. Or maybe they were being forced by someone else. Or maybe the immediate panic just subsided quickly, and they maintained this bizarre composure as they walked to their doom.
It's a profound conflict in the evidence. You have the frantic action of cutting the tent versus the composed reaction of the calm walk. You have to somehow reconcile a sudden, overwhelming trigger that made them destroy their shelter with the almost ritualistic slow walk away from it.
The bodies were found in stages over several months. The first discovery was Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonyshenko. They were found over a mile away, near the edge of the forest, next to a large cedar tree.
And they were in the most shocking state of undress. Krivonyshenko was wearing only thermal underwear, socks, and a shirt. Doroshenko was in a similar state, almost entirely stripped down.
But that discovery site also showed evidence of an intent to survive, or at least a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The cedar tree itself, it had signs that the 2 Yuris had tried to climb it, maybe to find a landmark or gather wood. Branches were broken up to 5 meters high.
And they had tried to start a fire. Small fragments of burnt wood were found. It suggests this desperate, futile effort to use what little they had to generate some heat.
Then the next search efforts uncovered 3 more bodies: Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They were spread out along the path between that cedar tree and the tent, and they showed signs of having tried to return.
Right, Dyatlov was found closer to the tent than the others. It suggests he might have succumbed while making a final, maybe heroic, attempt to get supplies.
And we even have this extremely precise, if unsettling, timestamp for the catastrophe. Dyatlov's watch was found frozen, and it had stopped at 5 hours, 31 minutes.
Which, when you pair that with the internal forensic data on the victims, it gives you a very narrow window for when the central crisis happened. It suggests something happened just before dawn. It tells us that whatever hit them in the absolute darkest, coldest part of the night.
The forensic evidence is really what cemented this case as an enduring mystery. It was primarily gathered by Dr. Boris Vozrzdeny, and it doesn't tell a simple story of freezing. It tells a dual story: hypothermia and inexplicable violent trauma.
Let's start with that first group of 5 bodies they discovered: Dyatlov, Doroshenko, Krivonischenko, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. Their official cause of death was confirmed as hypothermia, freezing. And the evidence for that is, it's indisputable. It's classic textbook stuff.
The autopsies confirmed all the classical signs: edema of the meninges, which is swelling of the brain lining, and sharp hyperamia, an excess of blood in the internal organs.
Right, very common post-mortem finding in extreme cold. And crucially, their heart cavities were filled with liquid dark blood, which is a typical sign of death from systemic cold shock.
But the most specific, the most undeniable markers were the Wisniewski spots. These are small hemorrhagic lesions found on the lining of the stomach, the gastric mucosa. They're a classical and highly reliable indicator of fatal hypothermia. It gives strong forensic backing for the cause of death for this first group. The body, shutting down, exhibits this particular internal trauma.
Dyatlov's autopsy also noted some light graze wounds, scratches, abrasions. They were consistent with falling, maybe tumbling down the slope, bruising on stone or ice. But these were all superficial. They were deemed non-life-threatening. They suggest a struggle or a fall during the flight, but not a catastrophic external attack.
And we have to address the state of undress, which ties directly back to hypothermia. There's this phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. The neurological mechanism behind it is fascinating and terrifying.
It is. When the core body temperature drops critically low, usually below 29 Celsius, the body's hypothalamus, which regulates temperature, it essentially malfunctions. Normally, your peripheral blood vessels constrict to keep heat concentrated in your core. But in this final stage of freezing, a paradoxical shift happens.
These vessels dilate violently. It's a last involuntary spasm.
And this causes a sudden flood of warmer blood back to the skin surface. It creates this intense, immediate, but false sensation of burning warmth. In response to this physiological hallucination, the victim often desperately tries to remove their clothes, which ironically just speeds up their death.
Now, here's where it gets questionable. While paradoxical undressing is a real documented thing in individual hypothermia cases, the sheer number of victims here, all 9 experienced hikers, potentially succumbing to the exact same psychological state at the same time, it makes that singular explanation difficult.
It's a stretch. Could the initial event, whatever it was, have induced a mass hysteria or a psychological trauma that lowered their resistance to the cold, triggering this collective response? The scientific model has to consider whether the initial terror was so profound that it just bypassed all their training completely.
So now we shift to the second group of bodies, the last 4. They were found in May, about 75 meters from the cedar tree, deep inside a ravine, under 4 meters of snow. And this group, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, they presented evidence that went far beyond just freezing.
Thibault-Brignol had a cracked skull. But Dubinina and Zolotaryov, they had catastrophic severe chest and rib fractures. We're talking about massive internal damage, multiple rib fractures, severe chest trauma. The forensic reports were specific. These injuries were described as being comparable to injuries sustained in a car crash.
But what makes that trauma so anomalous is the complete lack of external bruising. There was no corresponding sign on the skin or the soft tissue, no massive hematomas, no obvious wounds. The pressure or impact was applied in a way that just crushed the internal structures, bypassing the skin.
Imagine being pressed between 2 concrete blocks. The skin might stay intact, but the bones and organs inside are shattered. It suggests a massive, sudden, static pressure or impact, not a sharp shearing force.
And then there's the detail that truly elevates this case from a tragic accident to something sensational: the mutilations. Lyudmila Dubini was found missing her tongue, her eyes, parts of her lips, and some facial tissue. Similarly, Zolotaryov and Thibault-Brignol were found with missing eyes.
And when you look at the sensational theories, this is the element they seize on. But the mundane, though still very unsettling explanation has to be stated